Okay, so this is the third part of our Origin of Species lecture. We want to wrap everything up, kind of pull everything together as we wrap this topic up here. First two lectures, we're looking at what is a species and our biological definition, and then once speciation occurs, what separates a species and keeps them apart. Those isolating mechanisms are incredibly important to remember and understand that. That is how nature keeps two different species apart, keeps them from converging and coming back together. Natural blocks are there. We obviously can override that. We do it all the time with selection of individuals when we're breeding animals, when we're manipulating things genetically. We can override this. That's not the point. The point is evolution is a natural process and what is naturally keeping those species apart. So in the last lecture, we were talking about speciation, and we looked at allopatric and sympatric speciation. Okay, so again, sympatric, you're looking at some kind of behavioral difference, genetic differences that cause the populations to split. Allopatric is more of a physical, geographical barrier or event that splits the population. And we left off with sympatric, and we were just starting to talk about aspects of sympatric speciation. We called the first aspect, or the first type of sympatric speciation, autoploidy. Now with autoploidy, all of the chromosomes arise from a single species. So all of the genetics of that species come from that one species, and it causes a split because the information from members of that species is not accurate. So the example, looking at it here, is you have a diploid parent, and something happens in that parent genetically during meiosis that causes the cell division process not to work correctly during meiosis, resulting in an offspring that inherits extra DNA. So the perspective or the application or way to maybe try to clear this concept up is consider Down syndrome. The individual who is carrying the extra chromosome, the Down syndrome individual, received all the extra information from one of his or her parents. So the extra genetics come from within that species. Now, if that persisted generation after generation after generation, and those Down syndrome individuals continued to have offspring that were Down syndrome, and more offspring and more offspring and more offspring, etc., that over lots of generations could potentially lead to speciation. All right, so again, autopolyploidy. Auto is self. Polyploidy is extra genetics or error in the genetic information. Okay, so that's one type of sympatric speciation through polyploidy. Too much DNA, genetic information is different, but it all stemmed from the one species. The other example is what's called allopolyploidy. Now with allopolyploidy, this is where we have two different species that hybridize. Okay, so you got two different species hybridizing, and that produces the abnormal amount of DNA or the new genetic information. So let me make this a little smaller to fit this in here. So the idea here would be species A creates an egg. So species A, their egg has, let's go, 16 chromatids, combines with species B, whose sperm has 17 chromatids. Okay, that equals an offspring with 33 chromatids. That will then turn into 33 chromosomes. That's not how it should work. Species A has 16 chromatids. If it combined with a sperm with 16, that would give us 32 chromatids. Species B should have 17 and 17, should give us 34. But because these two hybridized and they created 33, that now becomes something different. It's not species A, it's not species B. We're going to call it species C because it has different genetic information. Sometimes this happens. In the animal world, it doesn't always work. Most of the time, the hybrid doesn't survive. That's that hybrid inviability. It doesn't survive. But the plant world, this can happen a lot more often, a lot more frequently. Plants do a lot of weird things when it comes to reproduction and mixing their genetics, making allopolyploidy or autopolyploidy types of offspring, and they survive. They go on to pass on their genetics, and that becomes a huge question for us. Do we call them a new species? Technically, they should be. They should be a different species. Okay, so autopolyploidy, auto is from within the same species that a genetic mutation, an abnormal amount of DNA arises, and that creates something new. Allopolyploidy is when you have two different species that hybridize, and they have different amounts of genetic material that comes together, and that produces this new offspring. Again, the key though is, can species C or that offspring mate and pass on their genetics, their genetics, their genetics? Sometimes when we look at this, what we see is that offspring, species C, sometimes the offspring can reproduce asexually and then continue to pass on those genetics. Offspring sometimes can reproduce asexually and pass on those genetics, and that continues to further the genetic line of those individuals. Okay, so sympatric speciation can happen at any given time. Just depends on a lot of chance. So when we look at speciation, it's happening. The environment plays a huge role in this. Often, when we see multiple species evolving in a similar area, it's due to competition. They're competing against each other, and what they start to do is adapt in slightly different directions, what we call adaptive radiations. So adaptive radiations is when species evolve into different ecological niches. All right, so the example we're looking at here, the picture, is of the finches on the Galapagos. Okay, so there's this ancestral ground finch that was a seed eater. Somehow some of those birds made it out to the Galapagos, they get to the islands, and over time they start, their offspring, their descendants, etc., start to adapt to different food sources. Some keep eating seeds, some adapt to eating fruits, some adapt to eating insects, some adapt to eating cactus, etc. And they start this adaptive radiation process where they're evolving into different ecological niches. Again, this is often done in order to decrease competition. If everybody evolves differently into different niches, it will decrease competition, which is a great thing because then you don't have to worry about survival. It's not as difficult if you're not competing directly with other species that are similar. So we can see that happening, and we see plenty of evidence in nature of adaptive radiation occurring and species evolving into different ecological niches. Quite often we'll see this thing called character displacement occur, and that goes along with the adaptive radiation. In character displacement, a species will use a feature, physical feature or trait that is unique to that particular species. So it's something different, something unique, something special that the other similar species don't have, and it gives them an advantage. So again, with our finches, the beak is an example of character displacement. Each species' beak is slightly different, and that allows it to obtain food that the other birds on the island can't, or the other species can't. So the small ground finch, little itty bitty beak that allows it to pick up little seeds. The big or the large ground finch, big seeds. They can't eat each other's food because they have these new novel traits. So character displacement is an important component of adaptive radiation. So again, it's a way to outcompete the others on the island, or specialize. That's probably a better way of looking at it, is you're specializing by evolving special, unique, novel traits. Okay, so here's a big picture of the Darwinian finches on the Galapagos Islands. They fall into different categories based upon, are they ground and cactus, tree, vegetarian tree, warbler, etc. But each of these different species is specialized to a particular food source on the given island. And this diversity is due to adaptive radiation and character displacement, and they all descended from the common ancestral population. So we can see these examples all over in nature. Okay? And then the last thing we want to look at is the pace of evolution. How does it happen? Two ways typically. And it's not an either or. It could be for a period of time it does one pace and then it changes and then it goes back and forth and it oscillates. But one pace or one speed of evolution is called gradualism. This is where there's a slow accumulation of small changes over long periods of time. So small, little, minute accumulation of differences over long, long periods of time that eventually lead to differences. So gradualism model here, ancestral population over time, small differences, small differences, small differences. Eventually over big, big periods of time, you have completely different species. But we can see a slow progressive change. That is often found in the fossil record. It's sometimes easier to find examples of gradualism if the environment was stable. That's the key. With punctuated equilibrium, there is no change for long periods of time, and then a rapid burst of change in a short period of time. This one is often connected to environmental changes. So an ice age happens, glaciers retreat, continental drift happens, boom, rapid change with punctuated equilibrium. That rapid change doesn't often lead to lots of fossils sitting in the fossil record, because these rapid bursts of change in a short period of time don't always favor fossilization. Now, when we say short period of time, that might be 20, 30, 50, 80, 100,000 years. In ecological time, in geological time, that's a blink of the eye. Gradualism, long periods of time, can be millions and millions of years where we're not seeing major change. Okay, so both of these are examples of the pace of evolution. Populations will go back and forth. They may be gradual. Species may be going through gradualism for millions of years and all of a sudden go to punctuated, and then the environment stabilizes for millions of years and they go back to gradualism. But these are the two general patterns of evolution we see, or the pace of evolution we see in populations.